David stood in our meticulously decorated living room, swirling his expensive scotch, and loudly told his colleagues that my greatest intellectual achievement of the decade was remembering to buy the low-sodium chicken broth. I didn't cry. I took action. 7 months later, he would find himself staring across a courtroom aisle at the woman he thought only knew how to fold laundry. His world collapsed before he realized what hit him. For 22 years, I was a ghost in my own house. Not a haunting presence, but a structural one. The kind that ensures the refrigerator is stocked, the children are driven to soccer practice, and the husband's dry cleaning is pressed before his Monday morning meetings. My name is Grace. I am 49 years old, and for more than 2 decades, I have been referred to simply as David's wife or the kid's mom. That was my title. That was my boundary. David is a highly successful corporate litigator. He is 52, carries himself with the aggressive confidence that comes from winning arguments for a living, and views the world entirely in terms of billable hours. Over the years, the way he looked at me shifted. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of respect. The appreciative smiles turned into patronizing pats on the shoulder. The conversations about current events turned into him explaining the world to me slowly, as if 22 years of raising our 3 children had fundamentally deteriorated my cognitive functions. He loved me the way one loves a very reliable household appliance. What David conveniently forgot was that before the diapers, before I spent my youth managing the logistics of his ascent to senior partner, I was a law student. We met in law school. I was top of my class. But when I got pregnant with our first child, the mathematics of our life suddenly didn't add up. 2 aspiring lawyers and a newborn. Someone had to step back so the other could sprint forward. I stepped back. I packed my bags, leaving my ambitions at the door of our first home. I told myself it was temporary. Then came the second child, then the third. My law degree became an expensive piece of paper sitting in the attic. I never brought it up again. I swallowed my personal pride to keep the complex machinery of our family running smoothly. Then came the dinner party. It was a Friday evening in late October. David was hosting several partners from his firm to celebrate a massive settlement they had just secured. The house was filled with the sharp, arrogant laughter of men who believe they own the universe. I was standing alone in the kitchen, arranging a tray of crab-stuffed mushrooms, playing my role to perfection. When I carried the silver platter toward the den, the heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I stopped walking. My hand hovered over the doorknob. "Grace?" I heard David's voice, thick with amusement and premium-aged whiskey. "No, Grace doesn't handle the investments. She stays home. She is brilliant with the kids, of course, but she hasn't looked at a contract since the Clinton administration. Let us just say she knows her lane. Legal matters, complex matters, those are for the men to handle. She would get dizzy looking at a tort." The large room erupted in polite, complicit chuckles. My blood ran cold. I stood there in the hallway, holding 40 pounds of silver, and felt something inside my chest quietly snap. It wasn't a violent break. It was a painfully clean, surgical fracture. All the years of silent sacrifice, all the nights I stayed up nursing sick babies so he could prep for depositions, all the times I curated his perfect life, reduced to a punchline. For men who paid people to clean their toilets. I didn't push the door open. I didn't drop the tray. I just turned around, walked back to the kitchen, set the platter down on the counter, and stared out the window. I kept my voice steady as I told the caterer I had a headache and went upstairs. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't cry either. Tears are for people who feel helpless. I didn't feel helpless anymore. I felt completely awake. You see, there was a detail about my life that David was entirely unaware of. A secret I had been cultivating in the dead of night, at the kitchen island, long after the rest of the house was asleep. When our youngest left for college, the silence in the house had become deafening. So I went to the attic. I opened that dusty box. And for the past 2 years, while David thought I was reading romance novels or browsing home decor catalogs on my tablet, I had been rigorously studying. 3 weeks before that dinner party, I had quietly driven to the testing center. I sat for the state bar exam. I was just waiting for the results. That night, listening to his mockery echo in my head, I realized something profound about the architecture of a one-sided marriage. We tell ourselves that staying quiet is a virtue. We call it keeping the peace. We convince ourselves that by absorbing the disrespect, by shrinking our own presence, we are protecting our families from conflict. But keeping the peace is just slow self-destruction with a polite name. When you constantly mute your own voice to make someone else comfortable, they don't appreciate your silence. They just assume you have nothing to say. You train them to view you as empty space. Gaslighting in a family system doesn't always look like shouting or overt abuse. Sometimes, it looks exactly like a husband standing in a room full of people, casually erasing your entire intellect, while you stand in the hallway holding his dinner. The letter that would destroy his fragile ego arrived in the mail the following week. What I've told you so far is how he kept me in the shadows for 2 decades. What comes next is how I stepped into the light, entirely on my own terms. The envelope bore the embossed logo of Sterling and Croft, the most formidable corporate litigation firm in the state. They were the direct competitors of David's firm. I had interviewed with them after receiving my bar exam results. I passed on the first try, scoring in the 99th percentile. I hadn't told David. David always checked the mail. He liked to control the flow of information, the bills, the invitations. I was upstairs putting away fresh towels when I heard his voice echo from the foyer. It wasn't a shout. It was a loud, confused bark. "Grace? Come down here." When I reached the bottom of the staircase, he was holding the cream-colored parchment. He had already torn it open. He didn't even consider that a letter from a top-tier law firm might actually belong to his wife. He assumed it was a misdirected correspondence for him, or perhaps a marketing gimmick. "Did you see this thing?" he asked, waving the paper. "Sterling and Croft sent an offer letter here. It says Grace Lawson." They must have pulled from some ancient mailing list. The audacity of these recruiters. I should call Harrison and tell him his HR department is an absolute joke. I walked down the final 2 steps, my expression completely flat. They didn't mix up the names, David. He stopped waving the letter. He looked at me, his brow furrowing as if I had just spoken to him in a dead language. "What are you talking about?" "It is for me," I said, holding out my hand. "I passed the bar exam 3 weeks ago. I interviewed with them last Thursday. That is my offer letter." For a moment, the foyer was entirely silent. Then David did exactly what I expected him to do. He laughed. I let out a short, humorless laugh of my own, but his was genuine, dismissive, and dripping with condescension. "Grace, please," he chuckled, tossing the letter onto the credenza. "You haven't practiced a day in your life. You're 49. What are you going to do? Be a first-year associate fetching coffee for kids half your age? You don't know the first thing about modern corporate law. Let's be realistic. You have a good life here. Don't embarrass yourself." I didn't argue. I didn't defend my intellect or my test scores. I simply picked up the letter, walked into the kitchen, and signed on the dotted line. What I'm about to tell you is the part I almost left out, but you need to hear it. The very next morning, before David woke up, I went to a different bank. I didn't use our joint accounts or the credit cards he paid off. I opened a checking account entirely in my name, using my new salary as the deposit structure. When you shift the power dynamic in a relationship, especially with someone who uses money to control you, you cannot rely on shared resources. You need to build a paper trail of your own independence. A paper trail is undeniable, legal proof of your autonomy. Financial abuse is still abuse, even when it looks like a wealthy husband taking care of everything. It leaves you dependent, and dependency is a trapdoor. You secure your own financial identity quietly, long before the conflict ever begins. David didn't try to stop me. He told his friends at the country club that I was having a midlife crisis. He genuinely believed I would quit within a month once the grueling work weeks broke my spirit. He completely underestimated the stamina of a woman who spent 22 years managing 3 children and a narcissistic husband. The partners at Sterling and Croft recognized my analytical skills immediately. Because I was older, I didn't have the arrogance of a fresh graduate. I had patience and obsessive attention to detail. Within 3 months, I was assigned to assist a senior partner on a massive intellectual property dispute. The hours were absolutely brutal. I was leaving the house at 6 and returning long after David had eaten. The dynamics of our household fractured quickly. The man who once mocked my lack of a career was suddenly furious that his shirts weren't pressed. We became two ships passing in the night, though one ship was quietly arming its cannons. 6 months into my new role, the senior partner called me into his office. We were representing a tech conglomerate in a patent infringement lawsuit. The plaintiff was suing for $80 million. The stakes were absolutely astronomical, and the strategy required a surgical understanding of the opposing counsel. "Grace," the partner said, sliding a thick file across his mahogany desk. "We just got the opposing counsel's discovery requests. It is aggressive. They are throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. I need you to lead the deposition strategy on this." I opened the folder. The first page was a standard notice of appearance. But it wasn't the legal jargon that caught my eye. It was the letterhead. It was David's own firm. More specifically, his name was listed as the lead litigator on the case. I stared at his signature at the bottom of the page. It was the same arrogant, looping script that signed the checks he used to hold over my head. He had no idea I was assigned to this case. He didn't even know what department I worked in. He had never once asked. I closed the folder, my pulse steady, my mind completely crystal clear. I looked at the partner and simply nodded. The official trial date was set for the second week of April, and David still had absolutely no idea who would be sitting directly across from him at the defense table. That was the setup. Here is where the shadows vanished, and the reality of who I had become stepped under the fluorescent lights. The morning of the preliminary hearing, the sky over the city was a bruised, heavy purple. I wore a tailored navy suit that I had bought with my first paycheck. David had left the house at dawn, leaving a sticky note on the coffee maker reminding me to pick up his dry cleaning. I let out a short, humorless laugh, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. The drive downtown was agonizingly slow. There was an accident on the interstate causing a gridlock. My GPS added 20 minutes to the commute, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I was going to miss my own reckoning. I walked through the massive lobby, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble, and barely caught the elevator just as the brass doors were sliding shut. I wasn't flawlessly composed. My hands were shaking slightly as I clutched my briefcase, the leather damp against my palms. I stood outside Department 42 for a full 30 seconds, regulating my breathing, before pushing open the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom was mostly empty, save for the judges, clerks, and the two opposing legal teams setting up at their respective tables. My senior partner was already there, organizing his notes. David was standing at the plaintiff's table, his back to me, joking loudly with his junior associate. He was in his element, practically vibrating with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed the room belonged to him. I walked up to the defense table and set my briefcase down with a heavy thud. David turned around casually, annoyed by the interruption. He looked at my face, then at my suit, and finally at the defense counsel placard resting in front of me. "Grace, what in the world are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice a mix of embarrassment and absolute bewilderment. "This is a closed preliminary hearing. You need to go wait in the corridor before you get me sanctioned." I didn't flinch, and I didn't lower my voice to protect his fragile ego. "I am not here for you, David. I am here representing the defense." I reached into my briefcase, pulled out the finalized motion to dismiss based on prior art, and slid the thick, bound document across the pulleys, head wood directly into his hands. My name, Grace Lawson, was printed in bold font at the top as co-lead counsel. David looked down at the document as if I had just handed him a live grenade. His eyes darted from my printed name back up to my face, struggling to process the impossible mathematics of his wife standing on the opposite side of an $80 million field. Their faces went pale, both his and his junior associates, as the reality of my access to the case files dawned on them. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out except a shallow, unsteady breath. The smug, untouchable litigator completely evaporated, replaced by a man realizing he was entirely unprepared for the intellect he had mocked for 2 decades. The judge's clerk stopped typing, and my senior partner leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with a quiet, lethal satisfaction. The room went dead silent. "I suggest you read the brief, counselor." When the judge finally took the bench, the ensuing 2 hours were an absolute massacre. David was visibly rattled, stumbling over his opening remarks. Every single time he tried to present his arguments regarding the patent infringement, I systematically dismantled them. I cited obscure precedents he had completely overlooked. I produced dates and technical specifications that proved his client's claims were entirely unfounded. I wasn't just competent, I was utterly merciless. I knew his rhetorical tricks. I knew exactly how he structured his arguments because I had spent 22 years listening to him practice them in our living room. Every time he tried to pivot, I blocked the exit. By the end of the hearing, the judge didn't just grant our motion to dismiss. He reprimanded David's team for wasting the court's time with poorly researched claims. David sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the defense table. It was in that exact moment, watching him physically deflate under the weight of his own hubris, that I truly understood the necessary mechanics of self-preservation. Boundaries are simply a description of what you will and will not accept. Enforcing them is not cruelty, it is absolute clarity. You cannot reason with someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. You can only remove their access to you. Leaving quietly, legally, permanently is the most powerful thing you can do when someone assumes you are trapped. As the judge slammed his gavel and adjourned the session, David didn't move to pack up his files. He just sat there, a hollow shell of the man who had laughed at me in our foyer. I quietly packed my briefcase, sliding the victorious court documents back into the leather pockets. My senior partner shook my hand, his eyes gleaming with profound respect. "Brilliant work today, Grace," he said, loud enough for the opposing table to hear. I thanked him, turned on my heel, and walked down the center aisle of the massive, echoing courtroom. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The echo of my footsteps against the marble floor was the only statement I needed to make. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the city plaza. If you think that crushing his professional pride in a public courtroom was the end of the story, you do not understand how a fragile ego operates when it has been backed into a honor. What I found waiting for me when I got home changed absolutely everything I thought I knew about the past 22 years of marriage. Walking out of that courtroom felt like victory. But the next 72 hours taught me what victory actually costs, because a cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. When I unlocked the front door that evening, the house was entirely dark. David was sitting in the living room, a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand, looking like a king who had just been exiled from his own kingdom. He didn't yell at me. He didn't throw anything across the room. Instead, he launched an immediate, desperate smear campaign, texting our older children and our mutual friends, claiming I had secretly plotted to destroy his reputation, that I used his resources to stab him in the back. He painted himself as the victim of a vindictive housewife going through a midlife crisis. He told his partners I stole confidential documents from his office, an absurd lie. But he forgot about the paper trail. I had receipts. I had the bank statements showing I had paid for my own bar prep, my own exams, my own suits. I had the precise timeline of my hiring process, fully documented and vetted by Sterling and Croft's Human Resources Department. When my children called, confused and worried by his frantic messages, I didn't defend myself with emotion. I simply sent them the facts, the dates, the objective reality of what had occurred. The absolute truth is always incredibly quiet when compared directly to a frantic lie. David tried to spin the narrative, telling me I had humiliated him on purpose, that I had broken the fundamental trust of our marriage by keeping my career a secret. He tried to make me feel terrible for succeeding, for being brilliant, for doing exactly what he did every single day. This brings me to a realization that I wish someone had explained to me 22 years ago, especially regarding the difference between guilt and shame within a toxic family system. Guilt is the feeling that you did something wrong. It is tied to an action. Shame is the insidious, deeply planted belief that you are wrong. It is tied to your identity. For over 2 decades, David had weaponized shame against me. He made me believe that my intellect was a burden, that my ambition was something to be embarrassed of, and that my only value lay in being the silent foundation to his towering success. Narcissistic systems use your own empathy as a weapon against you. They convince you that enforcing your boundaries is a selfish act, that demanding basic respect is a betrayal of the family unit. In these dynamics, there is always a golden child in our house. It was David himself and his untouchable career, while the person who sacrifices the most is systematically a dead into the scapegoat. Trauma bonding makes it nearly impossible to see the cage you are living in. You stay loyal to the person hurting you because they have convinced you that nobody else could possibly value you. I realized standing in that living room that I didn't feel guilty for destroying his case, because I hadn't done anything legally or morally wrong. I had simply done my job. The shame he was trying to project onto me was actually his own. He was ashamed that he had underestimated me, and he was trying to hand that heavy, suffocating emotion back to me. I entirely refused to carry his emotional baggage for a single second anymore. He looked at me from the sofa, his eyes red and exhausted, finally seeing me not as a reliable appliance, but as a formidable adversary he could not defeat. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, hollow desperation. It was a stunning reversal of power that I savored in absolute, profound silence. "You ruined me," he whispered, his voice cracking in the dark room. "My partners are furious. The client is threatening a malpractice suit. I am the laughingstock of the entire firm. Why didn't you just tell me you were working there? Why did you let me walk into a slaughter?" I looked around the immaculate living room, at the pristine life I had carefully curated for him while he mocked my intelligence to his ears. I didn't pack my bags to leave him completely and entirely. I didn't file for divorce that night. Sometimes, the most terrifying punishment for a man like David is having to live every single day with a woman he now knows can destroy him effortlessly. I walked over to the sofa, my posture perfectly straight, my voice devoid of any warmth, pity, or mercy. "I didn't ruin you, David. Your own arrogance ruined you. You built your entire reality on the lazy assumption that I was stupid." He put his face down in his trembling hands and, for the first time in 22 years of marriage, he genuinely apologized. He openly and loudly wept. He begged for my forgiveness. He swore he would never underestimate me again, that things would be different. I let the silence stretch out, allowing him to sit in the profound, inescapable discomfort of his own making. I looked down at him, casually adjusting the cuffs of my navy suit. "I accept your apology," I said, my tone completely ice-cold. "But let us be completely clear about how things work from now on. The next time you decide to speak about me in front of other people, you will ask for my permission first." The person who sacrifices the most is almost always the person who is valued the least until they stop sacrificing and start taking inventory of their own worth. Enforcing no contact wasn't a strictly necessary decision for me to make, because I had achieved something far more devastating: absolute, undeniable leverage. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.